fact, Australia has a water shortage. I keep reading
Strikes a few Australians as ironic, not a bit painful. And we will return to that normal state. In my home state in West Australia, we actually have a problem with wildfires.
Right.
Burnt down a number of the houses in suburbs and the outskirts of Perth. And we have had this year, and continue to have, the lowest rainfall on record.
Right.
So we are tinderbox dry.
I see.
So this is not distributed across the continent. Then, of course, we had the cyclone, which hit on a front which was as the extent of the east coast of the United States.
Right.
And that created an additional set of problems for which we had to use the defence forces a bit more intensively than was used in regard to the floods.
But but in terms of the rain, it is essentially a dry country. I mean,
it's dry country, but well, most of it is a dry country. The centre of it is a dry country. The north of it's tropical.
Right, sure. Yes.
They don't get rain shortages up in Cairns. And
but
so
in Sydney, you're only limited to watering your garden twice a week.
Yeah, you do get that. We will return to that as night follows day, and this is just a phase, a short phase. It will not be the routine experience, but it's routine enough for us to be certain that during the wet, which are about the months that we're in now, there'll be floods in Queensland, there'll be floods in New South Wales. They come with regularity, but with much more specificity than this lot did.
Can I ask you about the actual state of US-Australian relations?
Very good. There's really a very strong bond. It's a bond which has been evolving. It is, at its core, it's military and intelligence. So the biggest component of the relationship revolves around that. But that is sort of the part of the relationship which is discussed and it's presented out there in the public. But the day-to-day activities of the alliance relationship tends to press more to prevailing international diplomatic issues than it does to defence issues, which tend to be much more deeply rooted and roll through with their own rhythm.
What is an everyday diplomatic issue, for example?
Well, I guess, for example, there'd be what we're reporting in relation to Egypt. Now, that's not an issue between Australia and the United States, but Australia needs information.
Right.
It wants it. It needed it for consular purposes, but it wants it for just for that our political class can be properly informed about things. And there's immense. This is a huge global information base. So therefore we rapidly engage them. Come closer to home, and of course the area for which is most critical for Australia is what's described as the Far East by some, as the Asia Pacific by others, East Asia by others, but that's the zone of greatest importance to us.
Right.
So the character of relationships between the United States and individual nations in that region, and how the US relates to the region collectively, is important to us. It was important to us, for example, that the United States engage itself in the East Asia Summit,
right,
become part of that process. It's a constant theme for us in Australia to try to push the priorities in American foreign policy towards that area. But one of the things the first things I said when I came here talking about a further issue, which is the idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a trade agreement currently under negotiation. I went down and gave a bit of evidence to I think the Foreign Trade Commission, International Trade Commission, anyway, that they had some task to take a look at the idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade pact. And my opening remarks were the happiness, prosperity and strength of the United States is an Australian national interest.
Right.
And so we take a pretty strong view that when we offer advice to our mountainous colleagues from Lilliput, as we approach Gulliver from Lilliput, anything that we say is motivated from the point of view that we want them to succeed as a result of suggestions that we're making.
As I understand it, your Prime Minister is shortly going to
Yeah, she'll be here in the next few weeks.
to discuss bilateral relations.
Well, it'll be her first visit as Prime Minister, and you do hope that the Prime Minister will turn. This is not set in the calendar, but you hope that the Prime Minister will turn in Washington annually, and the President in Canberra occasionally. And generally speaking, when the Prime Minister turns up, particularly for a first visit, in the discussions that she has with the President, they just roll out the full complexity of Australia's relationship with the US. So all the things that interest us in the character of the relationship will be out there on the table at one point in time, and if not discussed with the President, then with the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defence and so on.
Right. One of those issues, of course, is the Australian military presence in Afghanistan, as had been, and there had been also one in Iraq. Indeed, there was one in Vietnam, I remember quite well, when I was in Vietnam. Is there a time frame around the Australian presence in Afghanistan now, or is it still open-ended?
Well, we have several activities in Afghanistan. Most prominent among them is the operations of the Special Forces.
Right.
And the operations of the trainers, omlets they're called, associated with training a brigade of the Afghan National Army. And then, because we're responsible in Uruzgan province for the civilian processes, there's an armed force engagement with that, with engineers, and there's also Australia organising the interface between ISAF and the local population politically. So that will certainly be on the table for discussion. Now, what we have said about the training activity per se is that we expect it will take 2 to 4 years. That is the view of the Chief. 2 to 4 years to properly train that brigade. And then we expect to go into a period of overwatch, which has not been defined. But when the Prime Minister alluded to it, pointed out that overwatch in Iraq had lasted about a year. And then there's been no statement about what the character of the engagement would be after that. So the timetable is applicable to the training exercise.
And how do you think the Afghanistan engagement will end?
With discussions. It always does.
Right.
It's, and one hopes the discussions go well. Right. It's all wars do we.
Yes. There don't seem to be any discussions going on at the moment, so we're still.
Well, but in the interim, giving the best possible chance for a decent system to work for the Afghan people. giving them the best possible capacity to defend themselves and advance their own security interests. Give them the best chance, if they are prepared to take advantage of it, to decent governance. And the best chance for effective internal policing. And I noticed that General Petraeus has sort of started to engage the idea of local policing activity, which appears to be increasingly effective.
Afghan engagement is not very popular in European countries, but seems to be accepted in this country so far. How is it in Australia?
I would say that a very similar attitude as prevails here. Give people their druthers and they'd rather not be at war. But they also want a reasonable outcome, and they're also conscious of the association between what was previously there in Afghanistan and terrorist threats to Australia. Well, these are not hypothetical, they're real. Australians have been killed in Southeast Asia by people trained in Afghanistan.
Sure.
And the view that an outcome in Afghanistan in which that type of activity does not take place there is regarded in Australia as essential. Now that would be a pretty commonly held view through the country. Now there are definitely Australians who'd rather we're out of there. But when it was debated in the Parliament, most members and senators spoke, and the overwhelming majority of them on all sides were supportive.
No doubt about reflecting constituencies.
Yeah, or their own judgment about what was in the national interest.
Right. The economy. The Europeans are having their problems. The Americans are in slightly better shape. And yet Australia is going through an economic boom. 4% growth, 5% unemployment. How much of this is due to China?
Well, we are a producer of massive resources. And the region we live in is desperately hungry for them. It's not just China. If you took the totality of our export picture to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations,
China's 3/4, isn't it?
it's almost as big as the Chinese one. And then you've got Japan and you've got South Korea.
I thought China took 3/4 of your total exports.
No, not at all. There's plenty more. We ought to get you the figures.
Yeah, we'll get you the figures.
We'll get you the figures on this just to make sure. And when you do other sort of, and it's not enough to concentrate on the trade figures. You've also got to, if you're getting a proper international economic picture, you've also got to do investment.
Right.
And if you combine trade and investment, the relationship that we have with the United States comes up close to the Chinese relationship. So in mutual Australian-American investments, that's investments here by Australians, investments in Australia by Americans, it's about 900 million. And the mutual Australian-Chinese investments is 90 million. So that gives you a picture of the preponderance. I mean, the mutual British and Australian investment, I think from memory, would be about 500 or 600 million. So there's still I think in investments in Australia, China is around 10th. Though, of course, they're very rapidly rising. There's more Chinese investment in Australia than there is in the United States. But so it's a changing picture. But you need to. A lot of Australians also just look at trade figures.
Right.
But you actually do need to look at the lot to get a correct picture. And the interesting thing is, during this recession in the United States, in every year through it, Australian investment in the US has increased. There are now 9,000 Australian companies doing business in the United States. The average pay of a worker in those companies is about $80,000 a year. So a lot of them are high-tech companies. The biggest shopping centre only in the United States is Australia.
Which one is that?
That is Westfields.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we have 2 amongst the 20 biggest banks in the United States, and we've got. And when the building industry gets underway again, the largest brick producer will be Australia, will be Bold. And so there's a lot. It's just in one year, not this last year, but in the year before, for the first time, Australian foreign direct investment in the US exceeded US foreign direct investment in Australia. That was corrected the next year. But in that year it was we came in ahead. Australia has huge sums of money under management. We're the 4th largest sum under management in the world. About 1.7 trillion, and that will go up over the next decade to a bit over 4 trillion. So now you can't place that money in Australia. So fund managers are very interested in what's happening elsewhere.
Of course, as far as the Chinese is concerned, a lot of it is raw materials.
Yes, it is.
But the wool industry is still, I presume, one of your greatest.
It is dwarfed now by minerals and energy. It's imported, and so is grain.
Yes.
But minerals and energy now dwarf everything else.
What would happen? How would the Australian economy be affected if the RMB was revalued as the Americans are pressing for it?
Well, if you assume that the Chinese would revalue in a way, and I assume that they are revaluing it.
Yes, they are.
Assume that they would revalue in a way which wouldn't wreck their economy. Therefore, it wouldn't.
Right.
So that's the.
Right.
If they thought that the level of revaluation they're engaging in would do that, they wouldn't do it.
Yes. Yeah. But the Americans are very much in favour of them, taking certain steps,
and
because they feel that there's some inequalities.
And we're supportive of the relationship between China and the United States being a good one, and therefore the Americans have to be satisfied.
But how worried are the Australians? I mean, one speaks of the Australians, but how worried are the Australians about the Chinese economic progress being a bubble which could burst? I mean, I know that one of the great concerns of the moment is, of course, to increase the domestic consumption. So that, I was there, 6 months ago when they were
well, it's not something we can influence. I mean, the Chinese manage their own affairs, and they manage them pretty well. So, but we have a diversified export base, though China is a powerful component of it. Yeah, we do. I think, I could be corrected on this, but I think and you would get statistics like this, but it's not off a very high base. I think probably India was the place where Australian exports at the moment are most rapidly growing.
But not reaching the
No, nothing like the Chinese thing. But the Australian product is something that everybody needs. So that sort of keeps afloat. We're now about the 5th largest natural gas exporter, and if ConocoPhillips is right, and they're heavily engaged on the North West Shelf, within a decade we'll be the largest liquid natural gas producer in the world. And we are the largest coal exporter in the world. And though that took a heavy hit, I might say, the floods of Queensland, that took out about 50% of the coal areas at its peak.
Flooding mines and something.
Yeah, it did. And then there's iron ore, and then there's rare earths, which is a more recent thing. And so there's an awful lot of minerals production and energy production in Australia. And uranium, I think we're either the first or second largest exporter of the world. So these are things which people are going to need for a long time, and Australia's reserves are huge. So that will keep things ticking over.
Where do you, in the scheme of things, if you like, where do you see Australia in, say, the next 20 years? I mean, is it to the West, well, to the Americans, it's still, it seems to me, kind of looked at as a friendly but emerging place.
Yeah.
I don't know how much going around the country you have to do to explain where Australia is. I imagine...
Less than I used to.
Less
in earlier appearances here in the US. When I was a minister, I used to come here pretty regularly.
Sure.
I do notice a big difference from now. When I was a defence minister during the Cold War, and we have important joint facilities in Australia with the United States that were quite critical to the American, quite critical to the Central Balance,
right.
so critical to the American strategic deterrent. And so, you know, we had a bit to talk about. But what you were conscious, and it actually gave a lot of flexibility to your foreign policy, but you were conscious that in the sweep of the Cold War, you were backward.
Right.
The Cold War was focused on Europe.
On Europe, right.
And to a degree North Asia, and to a degree the Middle East. Southeast Asia and Australia, south of Southeast Asia, was a backward. But now, as American geostrategic thinking changes, Australia, rather than being a backwater, is the southern tier of the focal point of the global political system. The focal point of the global political system is the Asia-Pacific economy. And it will be forever. So there's a real shift in the value of Australia to the United States as an ally. And these things don't occur suddenly or shockingly, they're incremental. And you have to throw your mind back to what it was like 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and remember how important you were then, which was not a great deal,
Right.
compared to how you are now, which is a fair bit more. So where was Australia going? Well, hopefully doing good things better and better, and keeping a constant eye on the requirement we have to modernise ourselves, both in a political and regulatory way, and in an economic way.
As far as shifting people's perception, there is a conscious effort made by the Australians, I presume. I mean, because, you know, you could not be in Iraq if you didn't want to, and you could not opt to be in Afghanistan if you want to. But there is a sense that the Australians want to be involved in these things.
Well, we want the US to succeed.
Right.
That's important to us. We also, of course, don't want to encourage the spread of fundamentalist terror. And so you want to play some role in that process too. You have to make a commitment there. And most of our commitment, apart from Afghanistan, goes pretty heavily in agreements we have with folk in Southeast Asia.
Right.
But you can't turn your back on these realities. You have to engage with them.
But internally in Australia itself, how big is the Islamic presence, and how radical is it? And obviously in the region you have Indonesia and you have the Philippines, for example. But
the Muslim presence is small but growing. The Muslim communities are very well regarded. They make a substantial contribution to Australian national life. They are Also, of course, engaged by the propaganda of fundamentalists, and a number of people have been convicted of terrorist offences in Australia, or planning terrorist offences in Australia. So we're not any different in that regard from anywhere else in the world. There is one big difference, which not a lot of people know very much about, and that is the way in which schools are assisted by the taxpayer dollar. So we have a system of heavy support for the private sector in education, and about 30% of our kids are in private schools. And most of them, but not all, but most have a religious affiliation. And they all receive funds from the Commonwealth, which renders them, even though they receive funds from other people as well, the funds from the Commonwealth render them independent of any other source of funding. And we fund Muslim schools as well as Jewish schools and Christian schools. So that is, I think that helps positive outcomes in a relationship. Just sitting where you're sitting now is a really good friend of mine who's just been elected to the Commonwealth Parliament, and he's our first Muslim member, a fellow named Ed Husick. I think that, and the fellow who is the man with the golden boot, he was called, is our highest rugby league scorer. Is a gentleman named Hassan El Nazri.
And
he's just retired.
Is it a Sunni Muslim community or Shia, or does it? It's a bit of both.
It's both, but I would say principally Sunni.
You're, of course, like the United States, an immigrant country, but you don't seem to have the same problems that the Americans have with coping with modern immigration as opposed to historic immigration.
We are a country that needs migrants, and a country which since World War II basically has been built on the backs of a very good migration programs, very large migration programs. We respect cultures, and we do not discourage people from maintaining their original identities. But nevertheless, the amorphous Australian culture is immensely seductive. I remember a conversation I had with Jerry Adams when he was visiting Australia, and I'd phoned Tony Blair before and said, "Do you mind if I meet this fellow?" I was then leading the opposition. Right. "Oh yes, please, go ahead and see him." And it came at the end of his trip to Australia.
You were then in government?
No, I was then leader of the opposition. Right. And he was a very pleasant man. And Mr. Adams said at the end of it, "You know, I find this extraordinary. I can't find any Irishmen." And I said, "No, explain yourself." He said, "Well, I came here expecting to see what you see in the United States, with sort of heavy concentrations of self-identifying Irishmen in Boston, in New York and in Chicago in particular. I come to Australia, yeah, there's Celtic clubs and things like that around the place, but not the same." He said, "The culture has become genuinely hybrid." And I said, "Well, if you go to the Anglo-Celtic component of the Australian population, almost everyone who's been there for longer than 3 or 4 generations will have both English and Irish parentage in the family structure."
To a certain extent, but also remains separate. Well, that's really about it. I just want one last question. If I go to Australia, when I get there, are they going to take my computer and they examine it for porn?
Well, I hope so. I'd hate to think that you were importing pornography into Australia.
Well, that wasn't the issue that caused so much.
I do not think they would examine your computer coming into Australia, no.
All right, thank you very much, Ambassador. That was really nice. Actually, the business of post-war immigration. I was born in Malta.
Oh, right. Lots of Maltese in my old electorate.
My father was the legal